When we think of the history of peoples of Asia during the 19th and early 20th centuries, we often frame it in terms of their interactions with the West, Europe, and the United States. However, this focus often overlooks the ways in which the peoples of Asia interacted with one another within the context of growing European economic, military, and diplomatic power. To address this lacuna, this month of Talking History, we'll be speaking with Dr. Samee Siddiqui, an assistant professor of history at Drury University, whose work has looked at the intellectual and political exchanges between Indian and Japanese activists during the early 20th century, and the emergence of Pan-Asianism. I'm Patrick Needham.
And I'm Djene Bergeron.
And you're listening to Talking History.
Dr. Siddiqui, welcome to Talking History. It's nice to have someone from Drury University here for a change.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, your research focus is on the interconnections between people in the Indian subcontinent and Japan, which, when we look at the history of the 19th and 20th century, that's not usually the perspective we take. We're usually looking at how various non-European societies have interacted with, Western economic trends, intellectual trends, et cetera, et cetera. However, your work takes a kind of different perspective, looking specifically at exchanges within the Asian continent between different groups of people, and more specifically, of course, Indian intellectuals, or what we might say people in the Indian subcontinent.
Yes.
Because, of course, today you have India, Pakistan, Bangladesh,
Exactly.
Sri Lanka, but all of these territories were at one point under the authority of the British Empire. And then, of course, the interactions between individuals, intellectuals, activists from India and Japan during this period. So before we start talking about this specifically, talking specifically about the 19th and early 20th century, can you just go into a little bit of detail about, the pre-existing relationship between India and Japan? Because I think a lot of our listeners will not usually associate those two parts of the world with one another, but really there are kind of some long-term cultural, religious, and intellectual connections. Could you expand on that for us, please?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start, in part because it highlights how the 19th, 20th century intellectual exchanges and discourses that I look at, and we're going to talk about in the rest of the discussion, how novel and new they were, how exciting and different they were. So before that, in many ways, the relationship between India and Japan was quite, the exchanges were quite rare in terms of direct contact. So the contact between Japanese and Indian peoples, we have very few records of. So we have an Indian Buddhist priest who goes to Nara in the 8th century. And that's the earliest person that I can find, or my colleagues who look at this have found. And he was there as a Buddhist priest to open to inaugurate a Buddhist temple and this large Buddha statue. Aside from that, we don't have too many Indians going to Japan until the 19th century, as far as we know. On the other hand, for Japan, India was actually quite an important space, at least in terms of the imaginary. And that's because in Japan, as you know, Buddhism is a religion that has a long history and has a very important social, political, and cultural function. And as you might know, Buddhism emerges in India. So for many Japanese Buddhists in particular, India was a place, an amazing place where Buddhism emerged from. So while they had never been, many of them wanted to go. So there was a lot of longing to go to India. So you have attempts, and we have accounts of Japanese Buddhists wanting to go to India to learn Sanskrit, to acquire early texts, to figure out where the origins of some of the practices that they got via China and Korea came from. What I do think is kind of interesting is that outside of Indians going to Japan, as I said, there's only one that we know of, and Japanese trying to go to India, and they do not succeed. You do have Indians and Japanese, we think, interacting with each other in Southeast Asia, and that's because of trade. So we have a lot of Nihon machis, or Japanese towns, kind of similar to Chinatowns, that emerged in the 16th and 17th century in Southeast Asia, so in places like contemporary Vietnam, Philippines, etc., Indonesia. And that's where we think Indians and Japanese would have encountered each other as part of the sort of broader Indian Ocean world. But this is all to say that the interactions were, for the most part, an interest in India by Japanese And that comes through in sort of maps and sort of images, but not a lot of direct contact. And finally, there's a lot of interesting sort of material culture that is being exchanged. So sarasa, which is a really an Indian-made textile that has a big sort of cultural impact in Tokugawa Japan in the 17th and 18th century. And that comes to Japan via Dutch traders, initially Portuguese traders and Dutch traders. And you also have some records of, in the Mughal court, getting Japanese-made materials. But that, again, goes via Portuguese traders. So even the material culture that is being exchanged is indirect. So this is all to say very little direct contact between the two.
So in a recent article, you talking about the 20th century, you addressed two Indian intellectuals, one Muslim and one Buddhist, and their perceptions of Japan. You talked a little bit about why India was important to the Japanese historically. Why was Japan of interest to these Indian intellectuals?
I'm glad you put it that way, because I think that contrast is kind of interesting in the sense that that interest in India from Japanese remains, but the interest in Japan from India really begins, and that's in the 19th century. And that is something, I think many of your listeners might be familiar with, which is the quote-unquote opening up of Japan through gunboat diplomacy by the United States and other European powers, and then the emergence of a modern Japanese nation-state, right, modeled in many ways on Euro-American powers, on how to construct a centralized, modern industrial state. And Japan industrializes and modernizes very quickly. Right? So if you are sitting in Vietnam or India or Philippines, etc., you are either being colonized by Euro-American powers or are under the sort of are operating under imperial conditions, right, of Euro-American hegemony. So you look at Japan, a quote-unquote Asian power that resisted or was able to resist direct colonial rule by European powers. They had unequal treaties imposed on them, but they were able to get rid of them pretty quickly. Right? So they were able to become kind of similar to other European and American powers and were able to industrialize very quickly. In some ways, if you were looking at it from the perspective of an Indian, Japan at for a lot of its history wouldn't have been as sort of rich or powerful as many Indian states were. But in the space of a few decades, you've gone from a relatively small power to suddenly becoming kind of very similar to other European American powers, and in 1905 actually defeating Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. Right? So that is in many ways what attracts Asians in general to Japan and Indians in particular. And it's in this context that I saw a reference to a Sri Lankan Buddhist, or what we would today call Sri Lankan Buddhist, a Ceylonese Buddhist, who was interested in going to Japan because Japan was a Buddhist country in his view, and he wanted to get sort of Japanese support in his project. And I was looking at Indian anti-colonial connections. So I was looking at this figure called Muhammad Barkatullah, who was an Indian pan-Islamist who lived in the United Kingdom, in the United States, and ends up in Japan. And he has kind of two projects. One of them is about Indian nationalist project of, for the most part, or at least certainly his early part of his career, trying to get equal rights within the British Empire. And he's kind of transitioning in towards, okay, that's not going to work. We just want full independence. So kind of becoming a revolutionary. And he's in Japan from 1909 to 1914, and that's the person I was studying. And suddenly I saw that he had met this Sri Lankan figure, and I was kind of intrigued by why they would have, what their interaction would have been, what their conversations would have been, and even who were the people who were facilitating these conversations. And that's basically the thrust of the article, is trying to put them in conversation with each other.
So both of these intellectuals that you talk about were both born in 1864.
Yes.
And so were born at a time where Japan was not a major power, was still under European imperialism, but grew up almost contemporary within one lifespan. Both these intellectuals are witnessing Japan turn into a major industrial and imperial power.
Yes.
There's the Japanese victory over China in 1895. And then, of course, you talk about the Japanese moment following the end of the Russo-Japanese War. Can you just give us a little bit of context of why, for not just the intellectuals that you look at in India, but across the Middle East, Southeast Asia, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 was such a pivotal moment.
Yeah, it's really, I really love teaching about this in some of my classes, and the students are always kind of fascinated by this, is that I told them if you were to look at how this moment was looked at in China, but even in the United States or elsewhere, it would have been seen through a sort of racial lens, a very overt racial lens. And I said to some of you that might seem understandable, right? To others that might be surprising. But the thing that is most important to think about is 200 years before that, let's say in an imaginary world this war would have taken place and the same result would have taken place, which is Japan would have won. We would not have had this reaction, right? So something different is happening by the time we get to 1905, which means that globally it is seen through a racial lens, that geopolitics is seen through a racial lens. And this is all to say that in Asia, but also in Africa, so actually Pan-African intellectuals, African-American intellectuals in the United States, etc., also view this as a symbolic defeat of white supremacy. So this is something my advisor always says, that for Asians and Africans, it wasn't the moment where they realized they were equal as human beings to white people or in the global civilizational or cultural hierarchy, but it was an example to show that they were equal, right? So they always believed it, but in order to argue this in sort of intellectual circles with Europeans or Americans, this would be a way to say, listen, while your discourse and arguments, in part to justify colonial rule in Asia and Africa, uses this idea that you are civilizationally superior, that our culture or our history or our language, etc., make us backwards and we need your help, Japan shows us that that's not true. Right? This is a quote unquote, and I'm definitely using scare quotes here for the listeners, yellow power defeating a quote unquote white power. Right? So it was a sort of clear example on a global stage that sort of affirms what they all felt as it is. But it also sort of energized them because they said, while we all know this, this means that we should organize. Right? So for all the people who are in their view sort of sitting complacently and sort of just letting, in their view, colonization or imperialism based on sort of racial hierarchy continue, we need to band together. Look, Japan has showed us this is possible. But then also means that maybe instead of us studying in or organizing in European or American metropoles, so New York or San Francisco or Berlin or Paris or London, we also maybe need to go to Tokyo. And then we need to make a concerted effort to make Tokyo an Indian hub for organizing, both nationalists but also maybe even revolutionaries.
So whereas earlier generations of Indian or African or Asian intellectuals often sort of made a kind of pilgrimage to London, Paris to learn the secrets of Western civilization, this war, which is received in a very particular way because of the time that it took place, a time where peoples in Asia and Africa are kind of suffering under colonialism and imperialism. This provides a new potential, quote-unquote, mecca for them to go to, that perhaps Tokyo is the place that we need to go. So it's a kind of interesting moment in history because, if we go fast forward into the middle of the 20th century, we see Moscow becomes this place where colonized people go, as it's as the communist world is supposed to be supporting decolonization. And before this period, you have them going to London, Paris, and those cities. But you have this moment where Japan suddenly becomes the hot new thing for anti-colonial intellectuals because the Japanese have demonstrated through actions that a non-white race can defeat a white imperial power.
And this is something you're probably more familiar with. This also includes the Ottoman Empire and sort of Arab intellectuals also having interest. And it's interesting because it attracts all sorts of people. So you can look at Japan as an idealized mirror as well to tell you what you want it to say, right? So you could have both people who are supporting, let's say, the Ottoman Sultan and his critics all looking at Japan to tell them what they want to learn. So it's also partly in a way that you can make Japan into whatever you want it to be. But it's interesting you say that about the idea of Japan as a model, because one of the things that I'm currently looking at and my colleagues are also looking at is so there's a particular thing in India that some of your listeners may not know about, which is princely states, which were these sort of over 500 sort of territories, some of them tiny cities, some of them really large states with very rich ones that were kind of an indirect rule. So they were kind of princes and maharajas, etc., that kind of ruled their own little patch, but didn't have sort of direct rule in terms of having an army or independent foreign policy.
So these were, just to be clear to our
Yes.
listeners, these were provinces within British-controlled India, but whereas some provinces were ruled directly by the viceroy
Yes.
and ruled by British administrators, you had these other regions which were ruled by indigenous rulers with the advice and the help of British people.
Thank you for clarifying that. I think that makes it clear for the listeners. And some of them were also interesting in modernizing, in the same way that the Ottomans were, and people from Iran, etc. And so they would send their, let's say, intellectuals or administrators to Japan. So, for example, in Hyderabad, which is a very rich province, princely state, they send somebody, Sayyid Ras Masood, to go and study about the Japanese education system. And one of the things that he's very interested in is thinking about, do we need to teach in English? Or can we teach in our local languages? And what's interesting is if you go through his reports, he actually starts off saying, listen, it's not going to work. We need to go with English. We can't go with Urdu or other indigenous languages. You can't have a sort of modern education system currently in that way. And he goes to Japan and he changes his mind because he says, actually, Japanese didn't do that. And if Japanese are able to do it and he goes through and he studies the system in depth, he comes back with a different perspective. But you also have Indian princes going for travel and sort of learning about Japan. So there's also a big push for students to go to Japan. And that's partly to do with what we've talked about, but it's cheaper and it's closer. So it might be that Japan is an alternative space to learn about technical education, sort of soap-making factory.
So it's a little bit like today. If you're in, let's say, in the Middle East today or in Africa today, you might go to America to study, but you could go to China or you could go to even to India today.
Exactly.
Because now India is a big tech hub, and get your education there for cheaper. And also, it's like, well, I'm going to a fellow quote unquote Asian country or a fellow part of the global South, and not to the expense of Europeans.
Exactly, yeah. So you have, and thinking about it more broadly, you basically have sort of the Indians that start moving to Japan. So the people that we talked about earlier, these are small in number. These are sort of intellectuals, reformers that are coming in and out of Japan. But you do get a large number of students in the Japanese context and the Indian-Japanese context, a large number of students that sort of go there. You also have merchant families. So if any of your listeners have ever been to Yokohama, oftentimes they know that would be the kind of first place where Western sort of traders and intellectuals, etc., started moving to Japan, where they had a trading port. And there's a very Western influence in Yokohama. So I lived there for 10, 11 months doing Japanese, and you see that in the very posh, nice areas. You go sort of further in, you see that there's actually a really famous Chinatown. One of the biggest Chinatowns in the world is there. And so you actually realize there's also a Chinese. For somebody who does Indo-Japanese connections, you also have the history of Indians moving there. And some Indians are working on Dutch ships, for instance. Others are actually own merchant companies, Indian merchant companies that are moving there. So actually some of the oldest continuing Indian presence in Japan today are those very Yokohama merchant families from Sindh and elsewhere.
And Yokohama was a very, very famous place, maybe not today, but in the 19th century. It's in Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days. It's where Phileas Fogg ends up in Japan. It's like it was a place.
Yes, and it's I would recommend for anybody who's visiting Japan. You're almost certainly going to be in Tokyo. It's connected to the Tokyo Metro. You can very easily go from Tokyo to Yokohama, and I think it's a underrated place to go visit today and to understand history.
So we talked quite a bit about how the world interpreted Japan's role, but how did Japan interpret its new role after coming of its own in the late 19th century, and how does that relate to Pan-Asianism?
Great question, very big question. This is one of the things that my Modern Japan class, touches upon quite a bit, and that is, in many ways, the most easiest way to tell that narrative is. Japan, from the emergence of U.S. ships in Tokyo to the creation of a modern Japanese nation state, is trying to become equal with Euro-American powers. It's trying to be one of the people, one of the top states sitting at the table deciding what's happening. So no unequal treaties, yes, but also one of the major decision makers in global diplomatic affairs. And in many ways, after World War I, Japan's kind of got there, right? So after World War I, during World War I, Japan is kind of a latecomer. It doesn't have a lot of costs in many ways to being part of it, but it gets a lot of victories. And one of those is it is seen as, alongside Britain and the United States, as one of the top powers in the League of Nations. And if it was trying to make that club, the elite club, it has got there. But over the 20s and 30s is where things change. So not long after that in many ways. And there's a sort of very complicated history that I won't talk about, and I'll just focus on how it relates to Pan-Asianism. However, throughout that whole period, you also have this intellectual and political movement called Pan-Asianism that includes Indians and Vietnamese and Filipinos, etc., but has a lot of Japanese intellectuals, nationalists, military figures. And essentially their argument is we will never be seen as equal to these white powers. So we might do exactly what they want. We'll have a constitution. We'll industrialize in the way they want us to. But in the end, there will always be a racial barrier to being equal. So instead of us trying to do that, what we should do is unite with and ally with our Asian brothers. And that's where kind of the future of Japan should be. So not with Euro-American powers, but with these Asian powers. But they are not... The Japanese state and its foreign policy never really takes that on, or is trying to keep an arm's length, which is probably the best way to think. Because there's many elites who are in the Japanese government who are Pan-Asianists as well. But in terms of their official foreign policy, the Japanese state says no, right? And in order to appease or at least they would tell their British allies, no, listen, we don't take this Pan-Asianist stuff on. We are not a Pan-Asianist state. Don't worry about it. We are not trying to unite with Indians to overthrow you or anything like that. So don't worry. And that kind of changes by the time you get to the 30s. That the state, which has kept Pan-Asianism at arm's length after the Manchurian invasion and in many ways the isolation of Japan within the League of Nations, the Japanese state distances itself from these powers, so Britain and France in particular. And it's in that context that it sees Pan-Asianism as a useful tool. So this intellectual political movement that's been around since the 1870s gets taken up in the 1930s. And that's for the purpose of justifying a variety of foreign policy positions that the Japanese empire has. And that carries itself all the way up until the end of World War II.
So in this sense, Pan-Asianism is a kind of very vague political movement that, a lot of different groups kind of glom onto, but there isn't kind of a core ideology beyond, say, Asia for the Asians or something like that. And up until the 1930s, really Japan is trying to play the European diplomatic game. Mm-hmm. But in response to its isolation, and in response, for example, to the hypocrisy, for example, of the imperial powers saying, like, no, you can't control Manchuria when they're occupying all these other parts of the world, that's kind of seen as a kind of death knell for the pro-Western elements of the Japanese government. And as Japan becomes more isolated, they kind of take on Pan-Asianism and kind of fashion it towards their own foreign policy needs. Exactly.
And something that I think I should have said earlier when it comes to what is Pan-Asianism itself, this is another thing that I think is important for audience to recognize, is that even the idea of being an Asian was a new thing. So it's actually the idea of people who live in what we now call Asia, calling themselves Asians, it's kind of emerging at the same time as this thing called Pan-Asianism. So, and I'll define what that is. But essentially, first you have to have an idea that we are this thing called Asian. And that Asian is not a indigenous category, and that emerges in the sort of racial politics and Euro-American hegemony that we talked about earlier. So it's in that sort of...
So the Europeans group all these people who are radically different, Japanese people, Chinese people, Indian people.
And the same is happening in Africa, so for Africans.
They're grouping all these people together, and these people are being called Asians, and then they take on the identity. Kind of like, before the Europeans arrived in North America, Native Americans wouldn't call themselves Native Americans,
exactly.
or Indians or what have you, because that would not make any sense, because there's all these different groups, different tribes. Same in Africa. Before the 19th century, there's no idea of being an African. There are different people from different cultures. But this Pan-Asianism is a kind of response to European colonialism, and in a sense is kind of bringing groups that don't really necessarily have particularly strong historical. For example, you could say, yes, Indians have strong historical ties with Japan because of Buddhism, but you could also say the same about Indians and Europeans, because a lot of European science comes from India, a lot of mathematical concepts come from India, so these regions, there's no sort of inherent reason why India and Japan should be in a group together as opposed to, let's say, India and the European powers, especially because a large part of India speaks Indo-European languages.
Exactly. And I think with India, Japan is a great example, because while we talked about how Japan saw India as a sort of birthplace of Buddhism, it's a very vague and imaginary concept, but let's say, okay, that exists. From the Indian perspective, Japan is not really on the radar at all. It's basically only in this period that sort of emerges. And then there's an idea that we are Asians. Asia has some form of identity. How you define it or what basis you define that Asianness is where the differences come from. We are a civilization. And so that part they take on from Europeans. What they're disagreeing with Europeans is saying that that is backwards or below. So they take the concept, they take the idea of civilizational discourse in which Asia is a civilization distinct from this thing called the West or European civilization. However, they give it positive characteristics. And that's something you see in Pan-Islamism with Islamic civilization, and you see the same thing with Pan-Africanism and African civilization. And essentially, they all emerge in the 1870s. They all say that you are correct. In today's world, we are materially behind you. And that is hard to disagree with because you've colonized us. So we cannot have been equal or above you here. However, if you look in the past, you were quote-unquote backwaters, right? We had a golden age where we were way ahead of you. So they'll try to argue, some might argue that, actually the things about scientific discoveries or even democracy, we can go back into our golden age centuries ago and find those things, right? And actually at the same time, you were nothing. They also say, and this is something with Asians in particular, what they start arguing is that even today, while we may be materially behind you, first of all, it's a very recent thing, but also spiritually, great civilizations require both quote-unquote materialism and spirituality. And we still have that, and you do not. So even today, you need us. In order for us to have a harmonious, ethical, modern world, we need both spirituality and materialism. So while you may be ahead, guess what? We can learn your tricks very quickly. Japan's already done that. But you can't have a soul or spirituality without Asian religions. And so that forms one of the bases for the creation of an Asian identity. In the case of Japan and India, something that I think is quite interesting is that in order to create a cultural affinity and a history, right? So if you're saying we are Asian, you have to say, well, what is the basis of that Asianness? What is the history of that Asianness? And of course, they use Asian religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, some Islam as well. But for India and Japan, religion is the central glue that holds it. Before India was really important for Pan-Asianists, let's say in the 1870s and 1880s, early Japanese Pan-Asianists, and in here I'm talking about Japanese Pan-Asianists, China and Korea was part of their sort of real interest in Asianness, right? And so it was an East Asian Asianness. And with that, they could use sort of racial or linguistic connections. So the idea of dobun doshu, the idea of same script, same race, right? But as soon as you expand the idea of what is Asia and Asianness in order for you to have a political connection with them, you need to find different things to use to connect these places together. And actually what they find is religion is the ideal thing to connect large parts of Asia.
Dr. Siddiqui, unfortunately, I have to stop you there. That's all the time we have for this month, but thank you so much for joining us. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you, listener, for joining us for Talking History, a presentation of KSMU and the Missouri State University Department of History. You can catch us every first Thursday at 12:06 after NPR News. This show is available, along with our entire back catalog, at ksmu.org or wherever podcasts are found.